starting now. There's another one that's recorded too. This is why they don't give me nice things. So from here forward, it'll be recorded, Jennifer. So you'll get all the part that you missed, but everyone else got to miss the riveting conversation that we had in the first 22 minutes of this class. All right. So let me go make sure I'm doing this correctly. Okay, let's get back to the screen share. All right, transaction cost. So this is where it defines the transaction cost, what belongs to the buyer, what belongs to the seller, how it's divvied up, what's allowed. All costs obtain information of the homeowners association, transfer fees, or anything like that, certificate of assessments. It does allow you to choose whether or not the seller or the buyer are checked in here. If they don't check it, it defaults to the seller's transaction cost. One thing to just keep in mind on this is double check, like during the listing presentation, during your listing period, if you represent the seller, that they get some sort of email correspondence to and from their HOA that there has been no additional contribution fees or anything added to their HOA. We've had a couple situations where sellers have lived in the neighborhood since it opened, they're downsizing, retiring, whatever it may be, and they had no idea that the HOA had recently voted in a contribution fee. And so they didn't really take that into consideration in the negotiations here. And then there ended up being a capital call of, you know, a couple $1,000 at closing. And you don't want that to happen. This is also in this next paragraph is where you will define how much of the buyer's transaction cost the seller will cover. It is now done in a dollar amount versus a percentage. I get asked this every time. Can you change that to be a percentage? You can. Tread lightly though, because you're changing a contract. Is it technically practicing law? I don't think that it is. However, it just makes it you got to be a little more astute in the negotiations, because if you originally asked for $6,000 in closing costs and then they end up paying more for the home and you don't change the $6,000, they possibly could have gotten more. So it just keeps you on your toes a little bit more. Okay. Paragraph 7, financing contingency. This has been a fun one lately too. So financing contingency obviously discloses whether or not it's contingent upon financing. Most of the contracts are. What the terms of the loan are, what the maximum loan amount will be. All of these are information that you want to have filled in. If you're a listing agent and you get them at 100%, you want to probably not push back, but make sure that you're in a situation where that's possible. It does say when they will apply for financing right here. I don't have any reason to believe that this should be much further past when the current date is. If they don't have their ducks in a row enough to fully apply for financing within 1 or 2 days of submitting an offer on a house, that's not super reasonable in my opinion. And then it says you will give notice to seller of reasonable pre-final loan approval, either a pre-approval letter, initial approval letter that contains no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by blank date. Honestly, this is not helpful. They've made this very vague. This basically, in my opinion, added into the contract what most people were doing anyway, which was giving a pre-approval letter, which was not worth much more than the paper that it was on. So what's happened is people are thinking that this, they have to have final approval by this date here, when really this says no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions. So I could have just applied for the loan and not given them any information yet. They give me pre-loan approval, but they still haven't checked income verification or anything like that. Well, that's not an unreasonable credit, income, or asset condition, right? So this could add to it that really technically is final loan approval occurs when the lender funds the loan, which is at closing. So just be on top of it. I wish I had more of a clear area, but is a super gray area on this. So yeah, you're putting the closing date in that text box. Honestly, if you do that, you've covered yourself. And if the seller would accept it, great. I know a lot of listing agents and sellers will push back. It's a tough hill to die on if you're in negotiations from my point of view, just because let's say I put September 15th. Well, again, great. They're sending me a pre-approval letter that still could have some conditions that are not unreasonable. The thing that is happening though, and this helps prevent, this is a good thing to, if you've got a buyer that came in and said, hey, I've been, pre-approved by Quicken Loans, but I'm going to shop around. This next part of the paragraph kind of helps not prevent that, but protect the situation to say, listen, if you change your lender during the financing period, I have to notify the seller within however many calendar days here. And if it changes your closing date, the seller does not have to change the closing. They have to agree on it. And so if you do not, if the seller does not agree to change the closing date because you've changed lenders, you could be in breach of the contract. So we just need to keep that in mind. And then the condition, who the lender is, what type of loan they're having, the information on there. All right, let me check for any additional questions or comments before we dive into paragraph 8. So because we talk about this in other classes, I'm gonna give the 30,000 foot level, but not too much of a 30,000 foot level. So buyers are purchasing a home. They have an opportunity to inspect and possibly negotiate repairs for the home. There are 3 situations that can play out in this, and I'm going to start with the last one and work backwards because the last one's the easiest and the first one is the most complicated. So out of the 3 is repair procedure, due diligence, and then as is. As is basically says the property is being purchased regardless of what the buyer finds out about it. The buyer is more than happy to have an inspection done by a certain date. I don't even know why they put a date in there because it doesn't matter. And should they find out that the house is sinking with mold, having had a murder occur in it with every appliance not working and the roof falling in, it's just for informational purposes only. He still has to buy the house. He or she still has to buy the house. So as is obviously would be best case scenario for a seller because they don't have to worry about doing anything. Does not eliminate financing contingency. It does not eliminate the CO 100 contingency. It just says as far as inspections are concerned, you are only inspecting it for informational purposes only. Then there is the due diligence. Due diligence becoming the more popular, except for lately because of all the competition. But basically, and this is how I explain it, basically, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, due diligence means that during this period, the buyers can have the property inspected, and for any reason whatsoever, they can decide not to purchase your home. I know it sounds crazy. However, put yourself in the buyer's shoes. They are buying the largest financial purchase of their life. They're going to want a way to get out of the contract. It's just that simple. I'm not saying I love it. I'm just explaining to you in simplest terms. So what happens in this due diligence period is we have until blank date here at the bottom of page 3, where as the buyer, they have it inspected. And then during that time, they have one of these 5 things that'll happen by that date. They're going to have the inspection done. They're then going to deliver any repair requests should they want to ask for repairs. They can then proceed under the contract using this form or using a repair addendum with repairs you've agreed upon, or they purchase the contract as is, or they terminate it. Okay. Now, again, it's highlighted in here because this was a misunderstanding for a while. I don't think it is as much anymore, particularly because it's directly highlighted in here, is that delivering this repair request does not extend the due diligence period. The reason they put that in there is because in the repair procedure, the old repair procedure, by delivering the repair request, you started your timeline of when they would respond. And so that's not how it works. It is by the date at the bottom of page 3. If they do terminate, by the way, that's a notice of termination that you send to terminate during this, just so there's no misunderstanding that they are terminating. And then you would also have a release of contract, which would deal with the earnest money. If they do agree to have a termination fee in here, which we are starting to see creep up to, anywhere, I've seen anything from $500 to $1,500, depending on the price point of the house. I have found that most sellers don't care really too much about a number, but want a number just so they don't just so they know the buyer's serious. I had a seller just put to me the other day that I thought was brilliant. She's like, fine, $500, but that's great. I don't want their $500. I want them to buy the house. So again, this fee is similar to the earnest money fee, Sarah, that we talked about earlier. Our goal is not to get this. However, I do think it's fair for this fee to reflect the time the house would be off the market. So if you've got a house whose mortgage payment's roughly going to be $2,000 and they're going to have it off the market in a 2-week due diligence, I don't think it's unfair to say you're going to give me $1,000 if you terminate it. That becomes part of the negotiation. It does highlight right here very clearly, if by this date up here at the bottom of page 3, 6 p.m. happens, you automatically are moving to as is. So, for instance, we just had a situation where we're due diligence, negotiating back and forth. Buyer's agent sent listing agent the final final repair request that they had been talking about on the phone, and listing agent wrote back and said, yes, sellers are completely on board. However, they have a family member, if something has come up, they will not be able to sign until tomorrow. It was not a great situation, but it wasn't a situation where it would have been inappropriate to push the family member to sign the contract. It wasn't like someone had died or anything like that. So the buyer's agent said, what's the risk here? The risk is you have nothing signed. And at 6 p.m., even though you've negotiated for 3 days to have $10,000 worth of work done, you now have a contract that's as is. That one could have probably been argued a little more had they tried to pull anything fancy. But again, just keep in mind, 6 p.m., it goes to as is. So if you're worried about it, send that notice of termination at 5:45. Now, doesn't mean the seller can't come back and say, no, we'll sign the repair addendum, but you've notified them that they're terminating because you do not want to go to as is. And then lastly, repair procedure. So repair procedure basically is the inspection of a house with pre-agreed upon repairs. Okay. And this is becoming more frequently used because it's a more appealing contract from the seller standpoint. With the more frequent use has come a vast array of creative thinking on how to get around the repair procedure. So, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is how I would explain it to them. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, here's what repair procedure means. The seller is agreeing ahead of time what they will be obligated to fix in order to move forward without penalty on the contract. And that are these things right here. So when you have the inspection, you'll get the report back. And if any of the inspection says it's necessary to place the heating system, the air conditioning, the electrical systems, the plumbing systems, the water supply systems, the water waste systems to be conveyed in operative condition, or to make the roof free of leaks, meaning it's currently leaking, to address environmental concerns, or to make the improvement structurally sound, then we would deliver that to them by this deadline here. If we don't notify them within this time frame, then we've waived any rights under this section. So we want to make sure we deliver it to them by this term above, or by this date above here. If your lender requires any additional inspections or certifications, these are to be provided by the buyer as well. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure, square footage, environmental concerns, including but not limited to systems, mold, radon gas, lead-based hazards, including lead-based paints, wetland study, appurtenant buildings, heating systems, air-conditioned systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, water waste systems, as well as appurtenant equipment or appliances. Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection report. Okay, so what this has said, and I'm going to be very transparent with you right now. Simply by reading this again, help me kind of clarify. This is why it's so important in any situation. Go back to the contract and read it, regardless of how many times you've read it. Because we have a situation right now where the seller is refusing to fix the electrical that's set up in the storage shed because they say it's not part of the house. This flat out says right here, the appurtenant buildings would be included in that. Okay, so we've agreed on this ahead of time. So, Mr. Buyer, what this means is all of this is working, or if all of this is not working, and they agree to fix everything, you still have to buy the house. If all of this is working, yet you come up with a bunch of other things, as long as these are put in operative condition as per the contract here, you still would be required to move forward on the house. Now, if they refuse to do this, which they can, then you would get your earnest money back and we can move on. So then the next date is you have no later and then X time for the seller to deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs in the buyer's repair requests. Again, this is why it's important to read this, because what's happened is a lot of times, and a lot of the listing agents will do this, one of them in particular, I wish he was on here right now, he very comfortably always says, seller agrees to address all concerns mapped out, or all obligations in paragraph A. That's fancy, yet that's not what the contract says that you do. Contract states that you submit a buyer repair request making note of everything above. And then this says that the seller either agrees or does not agree to make the buyers in the repairs in the buyer's repair request. So again, this buyer repair request may have things that are in there that are not included up in the top part of this paragraph. You still have to respond to the request. Okay. It says the cost to make all the repairs to the heating and air conditioning system, roof-free leaks, would be the seller. Seller paid requests do not include the following: home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfather code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, and energy efficiency. Seller contractually agrees to make all the requested seller paid repairs. The parties agree under the amended contract. Repairs to any other items are the sole responsibility of the buyer. The seller does not timely respond per above or does not agree to make the seller paid repairs, the buyer shall, within 2 calendar days from this date up here, choose one of the following, which is to accept it in present condition, negotiate a new amended contract, which clearly, or for the payment of those repairs. So you can just say, instead of fixing them, you'll give them money, or terminate the contract by delivering notice. So you can terminate it unilaterally as a buyer at this point. If the seller, let's say this is 6 p.m. today, if by 2 calendar days, so if by 6 p.m. on Thursday we haven't done it, then I can unilaterally release the contract. So very important, 2 things, very important. Make sure this date is realistic for the seller to do the research to see whether or not they're going to make the repair. They're going to have to get contractors out there, that sort of thing. And then number 2, understand that if you don't, as the seller side, don't drag this on, because if after 2 days, they can basically at 6:01, how that would read is at 6:01 on Thursday, they send a termination and they're out.
Out and get their earnest money back out?
Technically, I would read this as they can terminate the contract. Yes. Seller would still have to agree. Is debt going up to a raised home considered structural? I would argue yes, and it would depend on the part of the deck. So for instance, if it's a railing, one could argue that's safety and not structural, and safety is not covered. It's a weak argument. It's a weak argument.
We just recently had that, and it was just a tough going back and forth, because it wasn't, it wasn't like the flooring of the deck, just a few loose rails.
Yeah. What kind of financing is it?
It was conventional.
Okay. Rails are big no-nos for FHA and VA. All right. Inspection rights. So basically, buyer and South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors reasonably perform any reasonable, ultimately non-destructive examination and make reasonable record of the property with reasonable, they like that word, notice to seller through closing, including investigations of off-site conditions, yada, yada, yada. Sellers will make the property accessible for inspection and not unreasonably withhold access. unless otherwise agreed in writing by the parties. Seller will grant the buyer the right to perform the final walkthrough of inspection in the parties within 48 hours prior to the closing date. Seller will keep on all utilities through closing unless otherwise agreed upon. So this is where it gets interesting, because it says it will allow them, seller grant the right to perform a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. It does not say, it just says it can be within 48 hours. It does not say, however, at 47 hours prior to closing, if you do the inspection and they're not done, that doesn't mean the seller's in breach. It just means that it basically says to the seller, it technically says the seller doesn't even have to be done until within 48 hours for the final walkthrough. Now, we're not talking about the repair addendum, because if you sign the repair addendum, that will override any timing and tell you when the repairs need to be done. The contract is basically stating at this point when you'll have the walkthrough. Bye, Eileen and Regina. We will miss you. Thank you for being here. I'm not calling them out. They were very kind to say they're leaving. I like when people do that. Anyway, so just keep in mind that this is basically saying that they have the right to perform a final walkthrough within 48 hours of closing. Now, the other thing is will not unreasonably withhold access. This is so vague, it's not even funny. Where we're seeing this right now is you've got a investment property, and in that investment property are tenants who don't love that the buyers are coming to see the house for multiple inspections. I would say it's unreasonable as a buyer of a home with a tenant in there to go in and see it multiple times for things that are not quite. It's one thing to go in if a vacant house or a house with the seller lives there and say, hey, can I come by and measure some things, that sort of thing. That's a seller who's trying to sell their house. If they have tenants in there, I don't think it's reasonable to state that you're going to do that on a regular basis with the tenants, as tenants have rights. And yes, the seller can force them to be able to come inspect the property. However, you'd also don't want to put the seller in jeopardy of defaulting on their lease. So just be careful of that. Appraised value. The contract is or is not contingent upon appraised value. If it says it is contingent, you have a contract price of $300,000. Appraisal comes in at $275,000. The buyer then everyone has some options. The first option is the seller agrees to take $275,000, then everyone proceeds with the contract, no option. The seller kind of drives the bus on that. Seller does not agree, then the buyer can. The seller says, I don't want to come down in price. You can then basically go back into renegotiation at that point. I will state, I'll default. I'm never want to be the broker that gets in the business of telling you how to run your business. If a house does not appraise and the buyer's kicking in money and the seller's kicking in money and the other agent is kicking in money, I don't know that I want to be the fourth part of that situation that's going to say no. You can, however, I do believe if you look at a situation where a buyer's paying more than they thought, a seller's getting less than they thought, and then someone else, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I'll kick in X amount from my commission as well. I'm not saying you have to. The reason I'm bringing it up this way in an awkward way is because a lot of people get real bent out of shape if another agent asks for your commission. I don't love it either. But if it's a situation where the listing agent's saying, yes, Mr. Seller, I'll reduce my commission by $500 because you're reducing your price by $5,000 and the buyer's coming up with $5,000, I don't think it's overboard for me to go to the buyer's agent and say, hey, here's what everyone's doing. Do you have any room? If they say no, that's fine. By the way, if they say no and you're the listing agent, that's fine. They don't have to. You've already agreed to pay this to them. Anyway, just throwing that out there. Wood infestation report. Again, even if it's as is, and even if you've negotiated out all the terms of due diligence or repair procedure, it's still contingent on the CO 100. CO 100 needs to be provided no later than blank calendar days prior to closing. This is important because if you don't do it by then and you are responsible for doing it, you could be in default. If you're the seller, if you're the buyer, you could be in default and the seller doesn't have to make repairs. So just be careful on that. It's either contingent or not contingent upon this. As I said, the buyer or seller has it inspected. The buyer or seller selects the inspector, and the buyer or seller delivers notice of the of having it done. I've always been a fan that the buyer does it. This is your inspector. This is who you have going to do it. If you are the buyer and the contract says the seller is going to do it, and you decide to do it on your own, and you get conflicting reports, it's an awkward situation because you've already said that the seller's going to do it, and their person cleared it. We have this right now where we negotiated the contract. It was the seller to provide the CO 100. The buyer got a free CO 100 with their inspection. Came back with 23% moisture reading. The listing agent said, that's nice. However, we don't really have it scheduled to have ours done until next week. And it was 95 degrees and it just poured down rain when you had the house inspected. And so the following week, the seller sent out their CO 100 and the moisture readings were down below 20%. And now the buyer's kind of freaking out. Well, what's the difference? What's the difference? Well, the difference is here's the challenge. I see it from the buyer's standpoint, right? But had the buyer's original agreement or the original CO 100 been the official one, by the time they got a contractor out there, it would have also done a lower reading in moisture and didn't need new repairs anyway. But just make sure you explain that. So if your buyer then wants to send someone out or does so, it could cause some confusion. If the seller does not agree to make the repairs, again, they're obligated to make it to proceed. They're not required to make it. So if the seller comes back and says, you know what, I'm not going to make it, they don't have to, but they won't get the earnest money, and they basically, at this point, the buyer can then terminate and not move forward. However, if they agree to do them, then you do have to move forward. So the seller does drive the bus on that. Paragraph 12 recommends the buyers have the property surveyed, the title exam, which is done in closing, beachfront elevation, wetlands, any insurance, anything that you have to do that we suggest that you get all that done from the buyer and seller standpoint. If any provision here in the contract, which is in nature or in effect required to be observed, it survives the closing. Meaning if we agreed to do something in here and then close, we still have to do it. But understand that upon closing, you've lost all leverage from a buyer standpoint. Home warranty, what company, who's going to pay for it, how much it'll be. Fire or injury or casualty basically says if the property is damaged by any act of God, basically while it's under contract, we can renegotiate the contract. The buyer can still buy it as is, or they can also buy it and the seller remit any payments from insurance to the buyer to do the repairs themselves. Paragraph 16, property condition disclosure. This basically says that the buyer and seller agree that the seller did complete it or they did not complete it. If they did complete it, everyone is saying that the buyer, the seller has answered it as honestly as they knew how to. But this does not replace any inspections, that you still need to have inspections, and understand that you just can't take the seller's word for it. It's not to say they're not going to be honest. Now it does say if after the delivery of the property disclosure, if you discover any of the material inaccuracies on the condition statement, then the seller shall promptly correct the inaccuracy by delivering a corrected statement to the buyer, making reasonable repairs prior to closing, that sort of thing. Lead-based paint, if the home is built prior to 1978, you would have to have the proper disclosure forms and disclosure filled out by all parties. Any criminal or sex offender information is not the responsibility of the brokers to find, that the buyer and seller need to go find it. If you commission, if the buyer is giving earnest money and they are okay with the escrow agent putting it in an interest-bearing account, this is where they would say they may or may not place it in there. I do not know any escrow agent locally that has an interest-bearing account. So it's really kind of a non-issue. If they're a non-resident, they will comply with the provisions of the contract regarding state income taxes, which basically says that the attorneys can adjust for any out of or non-resident fees. This is an entire and binding agreement. There are no other agreements, oral or otherwise, modifying the terms of this contract. that no one knows about. So that would include any sort of lease back agreement or pre-occupancy agreement that have not been disclosed. So if those are on there, we've had this a couple times, or an agreement to make repairs or give. The big one is the rent back. They were like, well, we don't want the lender to know about it. Well, that's not how it works. This is specifically states in here you can't do that. Paragraph 22 basically says the adjustments will be made at closing to prorate with any utilities, any fees that are prepaid or fees that are paid to your HOA, taxes, insurance, all of that will be prorated to the day of closing. 23 talks about if they default, what the ramifications are for that and what they could be liable for. If seller defaults in the performance, buyer may deliver notice. They pursue any remedies available to the buyer, recover attorney's fees, and all of the direct costs of litigation if seller found in default or breach of contract. If the buyer defaults, basically the reverse. The seller can do the same thing. If either party defaults, the parties agree to sign an escrow deposit disbursement agreement or release the agreement. That's an interesting one because it's basically saying if you do default, then you're going to agree to go ahead and release it. That's always nice when everyone's happy up front. That doesn't really tend to happen. For instance, in our buyer last week, who just basically got cold feet. And she said, you know what? I have defaulted. I'll sign this. And then all of a sudden she was like, no, I'm not going to. Which technically, again, puts her even further breach of the contract. Mediation. So the contract says to avoid expensive, lengthy, uncertain litigation, the buyers may voluntarily cooperatively decide which mediator to hire, how to pay the mediator, that sort of thing. If they do it, for any dispute that the National Association of Realtors has a mediation policy or procedure they go through. I'll be honest, with most of the brokerages locally, particularly the larger ones, I mean, well, I shouldn't say all the larger ones, but some of them, most of the brokers work well enough where if they haven't worked it out, there's really probably not a purpose to go to mediation. The times where I see where we really push to do that would be either brokers that just vehemently disagree with, my stance or vice versa, and have zero interest in coming to any sort of meeting of the minds. But it's not a requirement that they automatically go to mediation. Paragraph 25 states that they were not coerced into signing the contract. 26 basically says that we are agents. We are here for representation in real estate and in marketing. We are not inspectors. We are not appraisers. We are not plumbers. We are not any of them as far as experts are concerned. That if any of these other areas are of concern to you, you should seek your own opinion. Paragraph 27 states the broker's compensation is negotiable. Paragraph 28 states is where you mark any contingencies, terms, or stipulations, or make note of any attached contingencies or forms. It lists some of them that are on there, which would be your repair requests. Well, that wouldn't be on this first one, sorry. It would be contingency to sell your home, VA, FHA, those sorts of things. That would need to be indicated in here. Notice is any unilateral communication, offers, counteroffers, acceptance from one party to another. Basically, notice and delivery will be given to the phone number and email that is stated on the last page of the contract. So if you want your email delivered to the right email address for notices, you want to put the same situation on, the same email on the last page. Paragraph 30 basically says that that the parties are fully responsible, that they're to verify all wiring instructions from law firms or banks. They are also advised that any audio or visual surveillance may occur in the property. while they're looking at it. And again, that would default to whatever the local law is on that. And then they also acknowledge in this that they've read, read, and reviewed this contract, the disclosure, that they're not just relying solely on my explanation. They've gone through and to see if they have any questions as well. Expiration of offer basically says when you're going to return with an answer. Make sure if you do return and the expiration offer was today at 5 and you respond today at 4:30 that you've extended this expiration of the offer so they can then counter. And then everyone's signatures and contact information after that. Questions? Oh, we got one in here. Got to chat with the client. Thank you. Oh, bye, Shenandoah. Good luck. All right. Anybody else have any questions? Anything jump out? If you are newer or unfamiliar, just fill a contract out and send it to me. Say, here's what I've filled one out. Find a listing in the MLS, your dream home, write up a fake offer on it and send it to me and say, shoot holes in it. I'd be glad to do that. Do that any day of the week. That's all, I'm not any better than anyone else at contracts. I just read them over and over and over. Like I said, I'm actually, as soon as we get off this, I'm going to call this agent on this, our agent on this deal regarding the fixtures. Cause for whatever reason, this time reading it, I saw specifically in there where it talks about the what the heck's the word I'm looking for? The shed that was built on there. So, all right. Well, if no more questions, look at there. Contract in an hour. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.